Okay, well, let me tell you, hello, 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 hello. It is good to be here. And as the last time when I basically I gave an introduction, I told you that I was from Mississippi. And also, I'm in Mississippi, and I told you that I was going to treat this like it's a porch conversation, right? Again, that was the first place that I got my curriculum. That was the first place that, I got my training. And my grandmother used to welcome people to the porch with this. Welcome, 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 welcome to this space. And look, we are now in the middle of America 250. I mean, isn't it incredible? I mean, when we sort of look at this very fairly new nation that was really fragile between 1775, then the war ends, then we go through the American Revolution. But then in the War of 1812, right? I mean, America was still so fragile. And here we are now, again, working for a more perfect union, right? Working for that more perfect union. Again, I would be dismissed. I would, I wouldn't, I would be, I would be remiss if I did not bring up this very strong reality. What I actually, again, like about what Thomas Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence, a document that sparked various types of revolutions. Let it be again, the abolitionist movement. It was mentioned in David Walker's Appeal. It was, again, the women's rights movement. It would be in the suffrage movement. And then it'll be in the Black Panther Party movement, and it'll be in the Viet Cong document, again, declaring its um, independence. And again, it's again a revolutionary document. But one of the words that they say in there that I think that we all need to make sure that we really keep in mind, and this is what this talk is about, right? It's about how do we hold these truths to be self-evident. See, when something is self-evident, it can vary from person to person to person. What's self-evident to me is going to be based upon my experiences as a person who grew up in Mississippi, post civil rights generation, the two schools that I would attend in Mississippi that are great. I mean, I went to two incredible colleges, but both of them were plantations. And I basically was able to go to these two places that were reframed into educational institutions where they were plantations for Blacks. And they were able to really um, shape, right, where I went, where I stepped, right? So to know that I went to one school that was a plantation and then became an educational facility, you understand that gave me a different understanding of space, right? One of the first conversations that I ever heard in life about injustice was the story of Emmett Till. And that would go into my work of anti-lynching. And I'm going to talk about lynching shortly. And I'm saying that to say, so then when I went to another school that was a plantation also in the South, in Mississippi, then what happens is that it's shaped. So what happens is I learn to, appreciate not only the natural, the environment, just nature in itself. Because when you're in these spaces, they carry space and movement. They carry energy. And so I share that, right? Because when we sort of look at what resilience looks like, right? What is self-evident? It really varies to the person. But when we collectively get together, it's mindy because everybody has come to an understanding. And when you work in collaboration, right, and you work in cooperation, that's where revolution is. That's where radicalism is. So I was radicalized, ironically. And that's why I want to share that early narrative. I was radicalized on two places that were not meant for me to be radicalized. It was actually the very origins of those spaces were basically plantations that were supposed to dehumanize and treat me as a production and as a woman, right? Not only am I production, but I'm also reproduction. So again, I had that dual experience. But then when you reframe the spaces that you are, that's why we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men, so when you go into that self-evident piece, that's crucial for revolution. And that's why reading and studying is so crucial and, so inviting, because that's where the liberation starts. It's in that reading, is in that gathering of information, in that process of information, and how you reframe. And that's what these talks are really about reframing and having an understanding that it's not in many ways, it's about, one of my mentors was a guy by the name of, he started off as Starkey Carmichael, but then he would become Kwame Ture. And what happens is that how do you get people to work for the revolution? And again, you have them to go through the process of reading. We live in a world, I have a clock now, you can't see it here, but it's one of those cat clocks that have the tail that goes like this, but it has the sound, the tick tock, tick tock type of sound. And what happens is that once you sort of get in, somebody gives you a perspective, they control your mind. Carter G. Woodson, and I'm paraphrasing, but when you control a man's mind, you don't have to worry about an action of their action. If there is no back door, they will create one. Again, I'm paraphrasing. But it's this idea of how do you look at liberation. So tonight's talk is about, again, I'm going to use biography, but it's biography by way and lenses of seeing how revolution can work. Not necessarily, so one thing about, we'll be very careful about when we talk about history. We sort of look for heroes, right? But, and then so when you do that, you have a heavy emphasis on the personality. But in the talks that I'm talking about, the conversation I'm about to give, it's about systems. And the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, they're not just governments, but again, they're systems. And again, so what happens is that I want you to, so we have that understanding. So I want to open about when, I want to open with a poem that I find is just interesting. It's by one of my favorite poets. Now, Langston Hughes is is my favorite. Well, I've gotten to the point now that I got several, but Langston Hughes was a person who introduced me to so much. I actually found Langston Hughes. So let me give you a little context. So I found Langston Hughes, and I was working as a librarian in high school. And I was going to put books back in the stack. And there was this picture. I mean, there was like a book, and they had a cover, and they had this guy there. They presented him as young. And I looked at him and I said, whoa, this guy is attractive. Let me look at this book. I can tell you, I would love to say it was more enlightening than that, but that's actually was my intro. So I go in and I look, and the first poem that I read was a one called Madam and Her Might Have Been. And then the second poem that I read was the one that was called Mother to Son. And at that moment, I sat there in that library, and I literally read 25 poems. I said, I'm gonna give myself 25. And I just became just fascinated with Langston Hughes. And we know that, Langston Hughes was a friend of the party. Okay. So this particular piece, when I was in when I was in undergrad, we ended up having something called Humanities Week. And it was so interesting. We did this readers theater, right? We were trying to be, And so what happens is, showing our intellect, And so what happens is that this poem, we came out from the audience. We put people in the audience, and then we came out of the audience. But we said the first line differently. And the poem is entitled If We Must Die by Claude McKay. And what happens is when we first started, right, you had somebody like, I think this guy, he sort of rose and he said, if we must die, okay. And then another person came up, if we must die, like with a question, right? And then it's not, so we opened it up like that. Everybody had their different spin. So I just want to read If We Must Die by Claude McKay, who was an immigrant, by the way, who came to America. If we must die, let it not be like hogs, hunted and pinned in an inglorious spot, while round us bark the mad and hungry dogs, making their mock of our cursed lot. If we must die, oh, let us nobly die, so that our precious blood may not be shed in vain. Then even the monsters we defy shall be constrained to honor us, though dead. O kinsmen, we must meet the common foe. Though far outnumbered, let us show brave, and for their 1,000 blows, deal one death blow. What though before us lies the open grave? Like men, we'll face the murderless, cowardly pack. Pressed to the wall, dying, but fighting back. And that's what that self-evident. That's why at the end of the Declaration of Independence, it's in several parts. It is the preamble, and then it is the grievances, and then it's the say, hey, British brethren, y'all didn't come up to us, so deuces. And then the last one is the Declaration of Sovereignty and Independence. I like those two. I mean, again, I like that structure, right? So you can see that it's not for light, and as Thomas Jefferson said in the Declaration of Independence, not for light and transient causes, but after a long train of abuse and usurpations. And again, that idea of what Claude McKay just said, though far outnumbered, let us show brave. And that is that self-evident part. You know, we like to try to segregate because that's the idea of, divisiousness, right? You know, they're not necessarily, one and the same. They're just not. That's what they try to teach. But again, it is in the collectivity. So today I'm going to talk about two women. And I'm going to start off with talking and telling the story of someone who I admire. And the first story that I'm going to talk about, the first person I'm going to talk about, and I'm actually going to do it in reverse order because one, lived before the other, right? But what happens is I want to talk about Shirley Graham Du Bois. Shirley Graham Du Bois is a phenomenon. And this is where we are when we live in a society that have us to sort of focus on, in many ways, people based not on necessarily their talent, but who they get connected to. See, that's the goal of the oligarchy. See, they have us to get into celebrating celebrity. That's why, again, I'm making this point very clear. I'm using biography to talk about revolution in process and systems, not creating celebrity. Because in many ways, that is the role of the elite, to get people, the bourgeoisie, to get people caught up and try to emulate. This is why I think this is part of the unfortunately, the internalized anti-Blackness, right, that we have in the Black community. It gets to the point where the celebrities that's been chosen by a bourgeoisie, to talk about, buying and consumption, to basically work themselves out of Blackness. So the idea is you can consume, you can buy, you can consume, you can buy, you can get celebrity. It is never where this anti-Blackness system is never under attack. It remains, there. You just have to work your way out of it. And you work your way out of it by consumption and then also emulation. I mean, it's a very strong trick, but it's powerful. And so then I'm using, again, biography to talk about systems. So let me tell you a little bit about Shirley Graham Du Bois. And I'm going to, hit at certain things at different times. I would like to give a nice chronology, going through this, from she was born here and then she, dies here. But I'm going to actually go to different places because her life is in different places. So one of the things that she does, which makes her very intriguing to me, is that she created her own narrative that goes back to, we hold these truths to be self-evident. She creates her own narrative. And in a second, let me just tell you what I mean by that. So, so she marries her first husband, and she marries her first husband. They have two kids. She realized that she don't want to marry him. This woman told everybody she was a widow. He was still living in the 1940s. You know, I'm going to tell you, you know, she comes of age, and I mean, he's still living, but she told everybody she's a widow. I mean, again, she creates these stories, right, to sort of get to a point, you know, like, hey, look, if that's what you need to hear for me to go and to move forward, that's what I'm going. I want to share this. To right now, I'm going to talk about the books. I mean, she wrote various books. She became a celebrity with writing books, right? She wrote a lot of biographies. What she was writing these biographies for was for young adult readers. She wanted them to, again, be able to look at that crucial stage of development and look at themselves and see themselves in a positive light. What happens is that, so in many ways, she's a portal. She's a portal to not only understanding the W.B. Du Bois, right? Because I'm gonna tell you about a story about that. And but then she's also a movement. So she created a movement, and it wasn't a local movement. It wasn't a regional movement. It wasn't a national movement. It was an international movement. She saw herself as an international citizen and human, you know, in humanity. And it really comes across in this beautiful life. So let me just tell you, she was born, her name she was born Lola Graham. Okay. She would, again, that's what I talk about, creating her own truth. She would name herself Shirley later on. And what happens is her father was a pastor, and they had a tendency to move around a lot, right? So that becomes crucial because, again, she get to see how people live in various places. But then also, what really becomes a friend, remember I told you I worked in a library, books become her friend. And basically, it would transport her into all of these places. And hopefully you've had that experience. I did too. I remember the first place that I ever, or book that really just made me shake in high school was one called Learning about the Eleanor of Aquitaine. Okay. Again, learning different worlds and where they transport you to. And so basically she was transported to these various various places. She gets married, like I said, after two children. She didn't like the marriage. She got divorced. And let me tell you what else she did with those two kids, the two children that she had. She left them with her parents, and she went out, and she was going to go out and make her way, right? Be the financial person that, you know, her family and the children needed. She would end up going to Oberlin. She would get her degree from Oberlin. She would basically advance and start. I mean, when she went and she wrote a three-act. It was a three-act play called Tom Tom. It was an opera. I'm sorry, an opera. She wrote this opera, and I just want to tell you what she had in the opera that was so, you know, just incredible to give you an understanding about who she was and how she understand her place in the world. When she made this opera, she's the first African American to write that was written and professionally staged opera, Tom Tom. It had three parts. She took you from Africa, and then she talks about the slave trade. So you meet this village, and it's in the slave trade. And then the second one is the plantation. Again, the dynamics of that. And then she ends in Harlem. When this was basically put on in Cleveland, she had 25,000 spectators, right? People came in. The audience was 25,000 people over 2 nights. You all, she had a cast of 500. Can't make that up. She had a live elephant. She had a 30-foot on stage waterfall. She had a 200-person chorus, and she got that chorus locally employed. So I'm saying all that to say she was an organizer. That's what that reading and the like sort of cultivating, being able to see very early on in her life, and that's going to really benefit what we know to be, who we know to be W.B. Du Bois. Now, one of the things that, again, she would go on, she would write this play, but I want to just give you again just a little bit more about her in this organizing. So one of the things that she did was that when she left college, she would end up going and working for the NAACP, which is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. She was so good with organizing. She was actually, and took pride in, the top subscriber to memberships. Yep, she was what they call an agent. She took in the most subscriptions. Again, what you sort of see is that when she was basically organizing and making these pieces up, making, moving and organize, I mean, working with people like Paul Robeson and Claudia Jones, right? As she was, again, doing this work in New York and going across the country. She also would go, and I just want to say this to you, she would, there was, she and Du Bois had an early relationship. He stayed committed in his marriage of his wife for over 50 years, but, there were, they had some relations before they would get married. And I want to bring this up because what happens is that when she married Du Bois, I think you need to know that context. He was actually, they got married in February of 1951. I want you to understand where she is in 1951. First of all, when they got married, she was 54. He was 83, right? And so, but when they got married, here's a story that's real. Ring, ring, phone rings. Du Bois tells her, look, I'm under investigation. She was like, okay, I'm from the investigation, from the federal government. Okay. And so he says, so, maybe we need to put this marriage on hold because his wife had just, died just a year before. And she was like, no, we're going to get married. And she actually persuaded Du Bois to marry her. Yep. And they got married in 1851. Now, why is this important? What was going on in 1851? Oh, my goodness, the Red Scare. But see, in the 1940s, she had already gotten the attention of the federal government. Remember, I just told you she was a great subscriber for the NAACP, but beforehand, she wrote books and she won various awards. And again, those young literature books that I told you about. But then she was also a journalist. She worked at organizing in the YMCA. She got under the attention of this one woman who was like, had anti, equity, anti-communist sentiment. And she basically went after Shirley Graham Du Bois, and Shirley Graham Du Bois ended up losing her job behind this because of her great organizing. And so when Du Bois told her, hey, look, we need to just put off this marriage, she was like, no. And they got married. And what she did, now, again, I told you she was a master organizer. So what happens is that they get married. And why was he under? I want to tell you why he was under investigation. So he belonged to something that was called the Peace Information Center, the Peace Information Center, PIC. And what the federal government said was that they were circulating petitions that was anti-nuclear weapons. So again, at this time in 1951, you have a group that the federal government is upset with people who are in peace movements because they saw peace movements as a front for communism. So if you ever wondered why peace movements, even to this day, get like a negative peace, it is because people see those types of progressive movements as a communist front. And so that's what they had him and 4 other people. They put them up. They, said that they were, going out and that they would, spreading communist propaganda through this Peace Information Center. So what she did is that once she got married, now why was it important for her to get married? Remember, I told you she was already in relationships. They had a long-term relationship. He was her professor. They were when they were in Tennessee. They, when they were in Tennessee when he was at Fisk. Again, they had had known each other. So got him. They married, so she could never be called to testify against him. Smart. See how smart she is. So they get married, and then the first thing she does is that she really takes the boys on like a road crew. She taking them around to all types of town meetings, right? I mean, they were going to, in every place that they would go, they would basically make the indictment against the boys criminal, saying that it's full of injustice. And what she ended up doing, she ended up creating this defense committee. So everywhere she would go, they were doing fundraising. And she raised $30,000 in that currency in 51, right? And then what happens is that, so eventually the federal government would drop the charges for insufficient evidence against the boys. Now, what happens is, I want to really tell you again why that is so important. Because again, that masterful organization, remember I told you she traveled, they did the town hall. Now, one of the reasons that the federal government dropped that charge, you cannot make this stuff up. That's why I love history. Is because guess who goes on the train that was coming from DC, them coming to DC to testify on W.B. Du Bois's behalf? Albert Einstein. And so therefore, the federal government did not want to have Albert Einstein, right? Basically giving a shout out to the boys, someone that they sort of hit on in these trumped up charges. And so therefore they dropped the case. Again, insufficient evidence. But it was her organizing, because I wanted you to know the age difference. Because for the most part, if Du Bois would have gone to jail, he would have perhaps he would have died in jail. And so then, therefore, she gets him, they get married, she goes on this tour. Again, she get those charges, get him off those charges. Now, the thing about it, what I want you to remember is then that the next thing is that, again, the atmosphere, the culture that was happening. This is in the age of McCarthyism. And so let me tell you another piece about her. So she got her husband, this charge off of him. But then another thing that she does is that, so during this time you had Ethel and Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. They were executed. Do you know that the Du Boises not only did the ashes to ashes, they read that, but then they actually end up trying to, in many ways, the Rosenbergs had two sons, and what they end up doing was holding these getting together, having people sort of surround the children, and they actually found shelter for them. They found a house for them. They had found, people to take the children in. And the one person who actually would take them in would be the person who would write the poem that would eventually become the song, right, that made Billie Holiday famous. And that's going to be Strange Fruit. He was an English teacher. He wrote Strange Fruit. And again, the persons who Shirley and W.B. Du Bois sort of, got in these arrangements that they had would end up adopting them. And so you got this woman who, again, was under this organizing, really didn't care, because in the 1940s, something happened. Her son actually going to a hospital. He did not get the care that he needed. And for her, she considered that the lack of medical attention led to the death of her child. So it really doubled down her commitment to being equity and organizing for all, right? And so what happens is that I like that story about how, again, even under scrutiny, even just coming under surveillance, they would go and they would help to find a home for the Rosenbergs, the Rosenbergs children. Now, another piece that I want to sort of get us to have an understanding of is, again, who she is. They were, again, under surveillance. I want you to understand that when you look at the files for the FBI, she had an FBI file. W.B. Du Bois had an FBI file. Hers was larger. In fact, hers were roughly about 300 pages larger. I mean, more extensive. Because again, they were under surveillance and she didn't let up, right? She continued to, sort of move. And so I share that because, again, I want you to sort of look at her as a portal. So one of the things that they did was that even though that they were under surveillance, and but the State Department would not give Du Bois his passport, and they actually kept their passport. And again, you got these people. It's something called the Smith Act, right? In which they were denying, people their passports and moving around. They did the same thing to Paul Robeson, and but they eventually get their passports back. And right before they leave, going to America, this is when Du Bois, while still on U.S. soil, he writes a letter that basically is the letter that he would use to join the Communist Party in 1961. And so I do want to say one thing, though. Remember I told you she raised the money, that $30,000. Going through that, I mean, that working for her husband's defense, she did two things. One, she would not let Du Bois, and he talks about this when he actually gives an interview to the Communist Party. He talks about, again, that trial. And he talks about, if you ever get a chance to hear his voice, to hear that interview, it's incredible. And what Du Bois talks about is how she wouldn't let him talk long because he'll start saying things that she thought that it would just take, have him to sort of wonder. So she limits him very much about what he could say, but it did hit them for finances, right? And again, that's where her organizing becomes important. And I'm going to talk about that just later on. But again, her organizing and being able to hold them financial leads together, because when she and Du Bois got married, Du Bois had really very little money, very little money. And he told her that, I don't have much money. But she said, hey, I got it. And she handled it. So, but anyway, so that year, Du Bois would write the letter to the Communist Party for membership. Now, what I want to do is I want to read that letter because I'm going to tell you, I am convinced that W.B. Du Bois is a powerhouse within himself. Of course, we already know that. But one of the things that because I've read so much of her work and how she sort of operates and the things that she sort of says, these are some of the things that he says. He said, W.B. Du Bois in an application in 1961, he said, the path of the American Communist Party is clear. It will provide the United States with a real third party and thus restore democracy to this land. And the reason that I say that is because that was really a theme of a lot of her books. And again, Du Bois is working too. So they're both giants, right? Intellectually, but I think they really, again, they fed off one another. And then Du Bois writes, it will call for public ownership of natural resources and of all capital, public control of transportations and communications, abolition of poverty and of limitations on personal income, no exploitation of labor, social medicine with hospitalization and care for the old, free education for all. I want you to remember that because that's gonna be important. He's like the social medicine and then also free education for all, training for jobs and jobs for all, discipline for growth and reform, freedom under law, and no dogmatic religion. These aims are not crimes. They are practiced increasingly over the world. No nation can call itself free, which does not allow its citizens to work for these ends. Now, again, I want you to sort of know what that application letter looks like, because when you look at the life of when you look at the life of Shirley Graham, particularly, right, in the 60s and the 70s, and what she ended up creating, these pieces, every last part of this is going to manifest in her life. So now let me get to it. So again, he writes the letter, they leave, they go to Ghana on the invite of Kwame Nkrumah. Okay, he says, come to Ghana. So when they go there, Du Bois is actually working on something that's called it was called the Encyclopedia Africa, right? And then what they wanted to do was talk about the story of Africa from the African perspective, right? And so that's what Du Bois was working on. Now, what ended up happening is that, and she made sure that they were working and they were moving around, and it was just an incredible journey. But Du Bois, he's going to die in 1963. I'm going to mention this several times, okay? He dies. She remains in Ghana. And then what happens is she starts to work in this Pan-Africanism. Now, why this is important for two reasons. She's going to be appointed she's going to be appointed the director of the Ghana National Television in 1964 after Du Bois dies, right? And one of the things that she does when she actually creates that radio station, right, is that she's going to do several things. That media that she wants to have control over, again, coming from that African perspective, is that she's going to have a decolonialized view. She's got 85%, right, of the programming was local, right? She wanted to make sure that Africans portrayed and they saw themselves in what they produce. In fact, to use her language, she wanted an anti-colonial and pan-African indigenous television system. An anti-colonial, pan-African indigenous television system. The next thing she would do, remember that education I talked about? So she created an infrastructure and training. Not only did she go and she traveled throughout internationally to find out what people were doing in ways of television and bringing infrastructure, but then she trained other journalists. Her son, David, her other son, we're going to see how that works out shortly when I tell more of this story. And then the next piece is that she believed in, please remember this, education over profit. So under her leadership, there was, they avoided all commercials. That happens is they focus right on educational programming for farmers, children, and just the general population. So it was, again, education over profits. Unfortunately, what happened, again, I told you in so she gets this appointment in 64. She's, again, growing up this system. And I mean, she put leadership, she was empowering women. She brought a lot of women, Ghanaian women into the fold. She wanted to give, again, space to Ghanaians. And then what she did is that she also wanted to bridge this connection between African Americans and Ghana. So what she did was that part of her programming was to go and make Ghana see a place where African Americans can go and travel, but then also they can have pride in and the like sort. So she used and she advocated a vision through the media. Now, why do I want you to remember this? Remember, that's a part of her extension of who she was as a person. Remember, her first books, her award-winning books, was about teaching young people about, having them to, build up infrastructures within themselves. That's why she went and she focused on those biographies. Again, providing examples about how to create infrastructure for self. We hold these truths to be self-evident. And so then what happens is in 1966, though, there was a coup. And unfortunately, Kwame Nkrumah, I'm a fan of Kwame Nkrumah, that's why I said unfortunately. Unfortunately, he was ousted. And so what happens is, guess what? When he was ousted, she was thrown in jail. She was imprisoned. But again, remember that organizing? She goes in and she has this organization. She's able to share with people and get some things that they had. And they said, okay, you can take several things. And guess what she did? She took 3 suitcases with her. And guess what those 3 suitcases were? Okay, what was the content? It had the records of W.B. Du Bois. Out of all the things that she could have, remember they had moved, and by the way, when they moved in 1961, they basically renounced their American citizenship. And so what happens is that she took W.B. Du Bois's work with her. And this is going to be powerful. Anybody who studies W.B. Du Bois. So in it, it had like his brownie books, his manuscripts, and the like sort. And I'd actually give you a little feedback on that. So let me just tell you how that would work for her favor. I am going to skip ahead a little bit because I'm going to go back in a second. But so when she came back to the United States in the 70s, what happens is that she would end up selling. You'll see words like donate. No, Shirley Graham Du Bois did not donate the Du Bois's records at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. They're going to use the word donate, but she did not donate them. She basically sold them the records for what is equivalent today to $1 million. And that's why they have this extensive collection at the University of Amherst. But then she also did what? She also said, hey, look, not only are you going to buy this, but you need to give me an appointment and my son David an appointment. He got an appointment in journalism. She got one in Black Studies. Now, again, so when she got out of, and she had to flee Ghana, she ended up going to several places. And one of them, she ended up landing in Cairo. Now, it was important about what she landed in Cairo about, but I'm going to pause there because right now it's 41 after, and I just want to take some questions. I want to just pause, take a sip of tea, and then ask if you have any questions. I'm going to pick up when she gets she gets out of prison, she gets those suitcases, and now she's going to go to Cairo and work with Nassar. So let us, we have any questions, Dee, can you see?
Okay, we're looking for raised hands. Jay?
Okay. I've enjoyed the conversation as it has went, and I was wanting to know how I could get it and share it with others.
From my understanding, this is going to, thank you so much, Jay. Thank you for your comment. And I look forward to even sharing a little bit more because again, this is someone we should know. From my understanding, it's going to be on the YouTube channel. So you can find it on YouTube. And I know the first segment, the first one that I gave on Tuesday, has already been posted. And I think this is going to post very shortly. So I hope that answers your question. Does it answer your question?
Actually, I closed Jay's mic, so I think it's the YouTube channel of CPUSA, and I see that Cordero has okay, Cordero, click the picture of the mic. There you are.
Hey everybody, this entire session, as like with my the comrades having this discussion here, goes so deep that even you being a librarian makes me have a flashback to me thinking about why I made a commitment to join the Communist Party. Is that I feel like as Black people, we don't know what it means to be violent or aggressive to one another for no reason.
Mm-hmm.
Like, just to have no justification. If asked, why did you do that? What would motivate you to go out of your way to harm somebody and start a cycle that's going to bring it back on to you?
And
I don't
just,
feel like.
I'm sorry.
Sorry.
No, I'm sorry. Continue. Mm-hmm.
I don't feel that I've ever had anything that's taught me that has a place in our culture. So that literally, I remember being in high school and the librarian giving me detention because of like bringing a late fee for a book. And I just remember thinking that the faculty, the staff, the people that were in charge of my education back in Arkansas, I'm from Arkansas,
Mm-hmm.
they weren't a team. They weren't there in our best interests, is the bottom line. And I had reason. it came back.
And you were
So
well, I'm gonna just say, tell you something, Daryl. I want you to. You are also, when you're in a library, and this is why Shirley Graham Du Bois's work is so important, and sort of look at it. That's why the three things she took. It wasn't clothing. It wasn't any of that. It was literally that work of W.B. Du Bois, because libraries are a place where radicalization can happen. And so therefore, that's why it was once denied to people. I'm from Mississippi. And that's why those spaces were once contentious places. Just, I don't know if you ever seen that movie Hidden Figures, when one of the mathematicians went in and had to get a book and read it, because the library is also a place, and that's why we have to study, is that the library is a place of radicalization. It radicalizes. And so I'm sorry that you had that experience in Arkansas, right? And it's like, but again, part of that giving you fines or whatever, having you to have that, in many ways, like almost a trauma experience, right? Was to, again, to that place that was the liberation place, right? It was actually to sort of, in many ways, create a de facto segregation for you. And so therefore, you don't go into those spaces that could liberate you to help you have that self-evident truth. But I just want to just put that in, Cadero, but please finish your point.
Okay, we closed Cadero's mic. There is another hand. Brandon, your mic is open on our end. Please open the mic on your end. There you are.
Hello, I'd like to thank you for another great lecture. I had a more general historical question, if that was okay.
Oh yeah, sure.
Um, the term fascism gets thrown around a lot these days. For too many people, I believe that their definition of fascism is just kind of this vague, quote unquote, authoritarianism. But for the Communist Party and for other communist parties, we define fascism as being the openly terrorist dictatorship of capital. Does that definition fit with the Jim Crow South? Is
Oh,
it is it accurate or inaccurate? Because the only hiccup I have is that the Southern capitalists weren't as powerful as the Northern capitalists. But I'll leave that to you.
okay, so you're gonna hopefully appreciate this answer, Brandon. I'm gonna tell you that I think that they very much were. I mean, so I want you to go and look at how the South. There's several things that actually happened with the capitalism in the South. Number one, within 1 to 2 generations, you just do a Google search and you just say, hey, how many generations did it take for the the antebellum plantation owners to get their wealth back? Within 1 to 2 generations, they were able to recreate, right, their wealth. Because again, the Civil War was about an industrialist oligarchy going against an agricultural one, right? And so what happens is that, so they battled it out, but at the very end, by the time of the turn of the century, right, basically the oligarchs in both areas was back in control. The South had gotten control under the Jim Crow laws. They had gotten under lynching, and that's going to be a second part of my presentation, under lynching, right? So they used the law and most definitely the violence. And so when it comes down to looking at what the oligarchy did in the South with labor, I want you to do me a favor, Brandon, please go and look up, just get a good case of this, is looking at the Elaine massacre, right? You really get to see how when blacks basically try to organize and try to, get, not only organize a union, but also exercise their right to vote, what happens? I just told you it's a massacre. But again, so both areas with the oligarchy would basically get back in control. And the one thing about the South was that remember 99, I'm going to talk about this with the second person I'm going to talk about, but 99% of people who the people who perpetrated lynching escaped punishment. They did it with impunity. That's what makes the South actually a little bit more dangerous, because the blacks had no, even though they had rights on paper, it was not reinforced. And what was actually reinforced was customs and values of the oligarchy against the labor, and again, to contain that labor. So it's going to become, again, a crucial point. And so Therefore, I would just, again, one story that really, I think, really sums a lot of pieces up is the Elaine massacre. And you spell Elaine, it's out of, and guess what, Cadero, this is part of your piece. It's out of Arkansas, right? Elaine, Arkansas is where this massacre happens. And so again, it's this piece, right? And again, it's about sort of a bridging. So again, I think that what happens is in American history, they try to give you this idea that the North was like a promised land and had more places and spaces. But remember, the very system called Jim Crow, right? Again, was actually came from the minstrel shows, and that was in the North in the 1940s. And those shows, which was like variety shows or people sort of black-faced, right? It was this guy by the name of Thomas Rice. And basically he had a song called Roundabout, have them to jump Jim Crow, because what Jim Crow and the minstrel shows were there to show was that Black people, it doesn't matter what they did, they were unfit for citizenship. And so that system that emerged as an entertainment, one of the biggest entertainment systems, entertainment systems in the North, would end up give the name that the South would actually give all the North in its shows gave the skeleton. The South is going to put in and make it, going to give it the meat in the body. But the very name Jim Crow emerges from, the mockery that Black people couldn't be citizens. And so again, but there was there was really no haven, because again, the system itself was still working together. That's why when you have to look at after the American Civil War, and I'm going to talk about this in the 1890s with the second person I'm going to talk about right quickly, is going to be about how, people organized, how they basically reunited, and when they reunited, they created these systems and put them in place. So I want to now go, I'm going to finish with Shirley Graham Du Bois, because Brandon, you asked that question, so I want to get to it, and I know we have a limited time. So if there are no more hands, I then would like to just go on and finish with Shirley Graham Du Bois. Okay. All right. So one of the things that I want us to sort of look at, so she goes to Cairo. So when she goes to Cairo, Egypt, when she gets kicked out of Ghana, she settles in Cairo. And what her goal was actually to increase and advocate for Afro-Arab and unity. Right. And she does a great job. What she does is that she also worked to do a bridge between the Northern and the Sub-African, Sub-African relations. So she works that way. And what ended up happening is in the 1970s, right? I was going to say something. She ended up studying Arabic. She ended up, again, continue to publish those biographies, right? And then she became an editor from abroad of a very powerful journal. It's called Freedom Ways. And that journal would actually be around to the 1980s. And it had all types of articles that, names that, again, you may know. Again, Paul Robeson, Angela Davis, a lot of folks, came out of that Freedom Ways and wrote about it. But she actually was able to have so much of that organizing that even abroad, she ended up creating this journal that was essential in left politics in America. She ended up, again, she worked and she made sure that she was picking up that sort of, that global diplomat perspective. Her causes, which I love, was that it was very anti-imperialist. And she really worked on all type of national liberation movements. And really, she was, again, working. And then what ended up happening was that she ended up getting, unfortunately, Bois would die of prostate cancer. And she would end up getting breast cancer. And so what happens is, remember I told you about those international relations and that medicine? Well, then she would actually move to Beijing, China in 1970. And when she moved there, the Chinese leadership just embraced her because, again, she had already been working with them, internationally when she was actually in Ghana. And so what happens is they end up treating her for her breast cancer, and she passed away in 1977. and they gave her a state funeral, the highest of honors. And so what happens is she's buried just a few steps away from Mosey Tongue, and a few barrel steps away. And again, she, gave us this wonderful, wonderful life and career that starts in the 1890s that go to the 1977. And again, it was one who made their own life self-evident. And so, Cadero, one of the things I just want to just say, because I'm thinking about your question as I'm talking, again, you were, had these queries. The big goal about studying for the party and reading the literature and getting to know, again, this information about how systems work. Like that was a system that you confronted in the library. It's a system that basically pit people against and do dividing. And again, it's a system that has created anti-Blackness, right? And internalized anti-Blackness. So there's anti-Blackness, right? And then there's internalized anti-Blackness. So what happens is it's those systems that's in place. That is the reason why Shirley Graham Du Bois wrote for those young adult biographers, right? I mean, these biographies for young adults, because again, she understood that they were living in a world that basically, again, was this had a lot of anti-Blackness, but at the same time, that if somebody is having the internalized anti-Blackness, that's a system that stopped people from crossing over lines and working collaboratively. Because if somebody is at turmoil with themselves, then it's very difficult for them to go into, get into these collaborations and in different communities and get working in different communities. So that's why I said she created her own narratives. Again, her first husband died, no, right? But again, she knew the role of being able to write and create one story. And so again, she would end up writing a beautiful, right before she died, she was working on this beautiful pictorial of W.B. Du Bois. And what happens is that there was not that many copies made of it, but it sort of has these pictures of Du Bois from the time that he was a child, a baby, till he gets into an older man, because she knew the power of how image works. So again, so when you look at her life, right, she actually went to go after she left Oberlin, she goes to study in Paris. She gets these relationships with the Africans and people who are in the diaspora. That's what's going to give her these pieces to write Tom Tom. It's going to, that opera. And again, her whole life is about building international, anti-colonial, anti-imperialist. And that's why the federal government came after her full throttle in having, documents, even, files even larger than W.B. Du Bois, who was constantly under surveillance. Again, she lost her job. She did that. The FBI was also, on her. So I'm going to move now, because I see now it's 8:58. And I just want to bring up one more person, because this is about, again, looking at systems. So she took on the system of, she basically used she used biography, her media, right? Because I just told you that, she wrote books. She wrote an opera. She ran a radio station. She had that too. But then she also had a television station. So she used the media to build, a cross international relationship that's going to help to topple, or ideally topple, the message of capitalism. And then help people. That's why I wanted you to know the story about in Ghana. By the way, of course, Ghana national television is still operating today, but that system of having people write their own narratives and being in control of how they're seen. Again, that's one of the best ways to topple a system. So the next person I'm going to spend just a few minutes on, she is my homegirl, if you would say, right? And I think that everyone needs to know her name. And again, this is about what system she took on. But again, she ended up, she paid some costs. And the person that I think that everyone needs to know, everyone, you know, because right now the bourgeoisie is taking her identity, and I think the family wants her to be so recognized that, and get the recognition that she deserves. So they welcome it. But again, I hope they can keep control over the image, in the story, her narrative. So the name that everyone needs to know is Ida B. Wells. Ida B. Wells Burnett, Mississippian, born during the American Civil War in 1862. She would die in 1931. But let me tell you, that living between 62 and 1931 is incredible. So what she ended up doing, she was born in Holly Springs in Mississippi. Her parents, Jim, Ida B. Wells grew up in this life, and I'm going to say, so in the Black community, there's something called the Masonic, the Prince Hall Masons. I can give a short lesson on that, but for the most part, they had a community. That's one of the pieces that they have. So people like to focus on the church community, but not those, other, elements of organizing. And one of the things that the Masons had was that when a member died, if they had any family, they were supposed to take care of one another. Well, let me just tell you about Ida B. Wells's personality. Her family ended up dying, and her mother and her father ended up dying of yellow fever along with the younger sibling. Ida B. Wells was basically just she was 16 years old. The Masons came up and said, we're going to have this child and this child and your child. Ida B. Wells say, no, you're not. You're not going to take my family and split it up. My family, my dad, and to turn over in his grave. So what she ended up doing was taking, and she ended up lengthening her dress, and she went to go and taught in the country. She made money, and then she basically came back to the Holly Springs. And you know, Holly Springs, Mississippi is not a city, but you get my point. It's more city than the country. And so what happens is, then she would actually move to Memphis. She would actually see the conditions in Memphis. Well, before she moves to Memphis, she was when she in 1884 she goes and she's on a train, and they basically told her to get off the ladies' car. Ida B. Wells said, "No, I'm not. I'm not going to get off the ladies' car. I paid first ticket." So basically, when they tried to take her off the train, she for the conductor, she went into his hand and she got a good grip with her teeth. And they tried to pull her off and pull her off and pull her off. And again, without having some of the flesh, that she took out from. She ended up going to a lawyer. She successfully sued. But then unfortunately, they reversed the decision. But again, that set up something for her. She saw an injustice. So then she would now move to Memphis. Again, she's taking care of her younger family. And her grandmother was the one that kept the children during the week. And what happens is that, so she moves to Memphis. Then she gets fired from being a school teacher because she basically was complaining that not only were the schools inadequate, but Blacks weren't getting the same pay. And so then she ended up going and she started to write a newspaper, and that was called the Free Speech and Highlight. So what happens is that, so in that free speech, she writes an editorial, about how it's not that lynching was happening in the South, not because of the lie that they were telling about Black men assaulting white women, but it was because of labor competition and that Black people were rising. She saw it. She saw it clearly, and she wrote about it. And basically, what the found of the white power, the oligarchies in Memphis, they went to her. They thought that a man wrote the editorial. They went to her free speech office and they destroyed it. Fortunately for us, Ida B. Wells was actually given a talk in New York. She would be exiled after then. She wouldn't go back, but she would also purchase a gun. And she said, if any lyncher come after me, I'm going to take one with them. And then she encouraged Black people to put a Winchester rifle in all of their homes. In fact, she said it should have a place of honor because she saw lynching for what it was. Before Ida B. Wells, again, she said that, a lot of people sort of took this that maybe this assault or something are happening. But when she had her friends, three prosperous African American men, one of them was the father of her godchildren, she realized that this was about capital, division, and again, it was about, the capital was the reason, and competition was where it was at. So she would have an anti-lynching, she would start an anti-lynching campaign. Again, she was a woman in the public sphere dealing with an ugly subject. Frederick Douglass would actually support Ida B. Wells. He would actually write the preface to her first pamphlet called Southern Horrors, and again, her second pamphlet called Red Record. And so what happens is, again, she gets this exile out of Memphis. She would move to Chicago. She would get married. She would work in the suffragist movement. She would organize. So she was still doing her anti-lynching work. In that anti-lynching work, it became essential. Again, it was the first movement after slavery. If you even look at the Senate apology for lynching that came out in 2005, 2006, if you just look at the Senate apology for lynching, it tells you that the ultimate expression after slavery in America about forms of oppression, they use the word racism. I'm using oppression because that's a system that can be defined and it's not interpretive. Racism have gotten interpreted. Oppression is a very definite term. And what happens is they tell you that that's the ultimate expression was that violence. And that's why, that again, the Elaine massacre and massacres happened like that throughout. And so what happens is, so Ida B. Wells then said, hey, look, we really do. Women need the right to vote. So now you got how the lynching movement, again, the anti-lynching movement would help to mobilize Black women in full numbers, right, through their club movements. Now, one of the outcomes are going to happen with that, I talked about W.B. Du Bois, right? Then they're going to have the Niagara movement, but then he's going to go on and create, and Ida B. Wells was there with the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Now, she didn't like their position, so she never actually formally joined, but the NAACP was initially created not to get rid of segregation, which is now in the history books is known for, but it was to stop lynching. And all of that was coming from Ida B. Wells's work. So Ida B. Wells organized a movement, an anti-lynching movement, through the media, through her newspapers. And then what happens is she would go on an international tour. She would put pressure on Memphis, right? Because again, the Brits started looking at it, whatever. And so what happens is she also encouraged migration out of the area. So again, in her anti-lynching movement, basically it went not only from national, but then it went international. And so again, she marries, and then they realize that one way to go through this is through again getting Black women the right to vote, and also organizing an organization that would actually handle and looking at it. So when you see that man is lynched sign, that a man was lynched today from the NAACP office, again, a lot of that is Ida B. Wells's. Again, the origins of the NAACP is anti-lynching, and that's that work. So Ida B. Wells would again go on, and she would work in the anti-lynching movement. Even when she had family, she would go and do investigations, but then she would also go into the suffrage movement. And thankfully for us, she actually, unfortunately, what happened was that people were trying to write her out of her narrative. And then right before she died, she started her book called Crusade for Justice. And her daughter, when she died in 31, it actually set, as I was telling you these important things about these files, right? It actually set, and her daughter actually finished her biography or autobiography in 1970, and it was published called The Crusade for Justice. Now, the thing about Ida B. Wells now is that they have recognized her with a Pulitzer Prize that was recent. Now she has a Barbie doll. They have it, so if you want to look at it. So with that said and done, I just want us to see how important these decisions are. about knowing the role that media plays, knowing how people can get control of stories. Ida B. Wells, just like Shirley and Graham Du Bois, they wrote their own stories. They went to, we hold these truths to be self-evident. And when you're looking at going against systems, you need people who have that type of um, 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 wherewithal to again write their narratives and put those narratives in a collective perspective, and that's how you do movement. So that's the story of Shirley Graham Du Bois and Ida B. Wells. And now my I conclude. Are there any more questions?
Okay, for the last time, we'll look for raised hands to indicate an interest in putting a question on the floor. And Carol,
Hello, this is the other part of Carol, Ismael, and I wanted to ask, immediately after the end of the Civil War, many uh, Blacks were elected to municipal and other offices in the South. What were, as a result of the armed forces being there, what was the movement that removed those forces?
Well, it's going to be two things, and I'm glad you asked that question, Carol. So what happens is that, so right during this period, you're right, many Black men, they got the right to vote with the 15th Amendment in 1870. They would have Reconstruction politics. Now, the beautiful thing about Reconstruction was that the South, remember, because the South really was, again, for the oligarchy, it was for, basically, it kept a lot of poor Blacks and, I mean, poor, kept enslaved Blacks, poor Blacks, and then also it had poor whites. And so there was no infrastructure really. There was no education system. There was, again, a lot of things, there was no infrastructure. So what was happening is when these Black men, particularly from my home state of Mississippi, and you had Louisiana, South Carolina, they were doing really some passing of some great legislations to build infrastructure because the South really did not have an infrastructure, particularly after the destruction of war. What ended up happening, you asked what movement happened. Well, what happens is that the Confederacy, when the South got redeemed, that means when the white Southerners got back control over the governments, what they did was they started using various laws. The Supreme Court, unfortunately, went and sided in a lot of cases. There's one case called the Slaughterhouse cases, if you want to just Google that, and they did a narrow interpretation of some of the rights that Blacks actually gained with the 14th Amendment in labor. It was 14th Amendment in labor that really, curbed that. And what it did was that it ended up going into, there was certain labor systems that were created. The sharecropping system, the sharecropping in itself was not the monster. It was the crop lien system, which was the debt system that end up bounding Black people to land. And so then with they being bound to the land through debt, and then when you have the disfranchisement that came from something called the Mississippi Plan, the Mississippi Plan was then put in place to try to null and void the 15th Amendment. And it did. It basically put a poll tax that required a constitutional amendment that wasn't passed until 1964, the 24th Amendment. And so what happens is that, and then you got lynching. So what happens is those three struck. You had a creation of an economic system that basically allowed whites, the oligarchy, to divide Blacks and whites, the poor ones, by labor. And then you had lynching, and then you had the disfranchisement. So then it was glamorized. Remember, I just talked about media. So it was this group called the United Daughters of the Confederacy and the Sons of the Confederacy. What they end up doing was they started their monuments. They started to create something called, they used this pseudo history called the Lost Cause. And in the Lost Cause, they created a lot of lies. It's a pseudo history. They said that Black people were happy, that the war was not over slavery. They said that Confederates were noble. And so they end up going on a full throttle media campaign. And then they also start to do what? They start to build memorials and monuments. And so what they did through the media, let it be the memorials and the monuments, that they end up going and then they went into movies like The Birth of a Nation, which actually praised the Klan for saving America after the end of the Reconstruction period when the Klan emerged. They end up, you have movies like Gone with the Wind, but even post civil rights, you had the shows like Dukes of Hazzard, and all of that was a part of this propaganda to go back to that original cause that Black people were not worthy of being citizens. And then what happens is it was able to they were able to divide people through really the media, and that's why Shirley Graham Du Bois is so important to study, because she was like an antidote to that story. You know, she was giving an antidote to that story. So again, it was a concerted effort. It was violence, it was economics, but then it was a role that the media would play. And so that was the movement. So the United Daughters of the Confederate, which still exist today, the Sons of Confederate that still exist today, what happens is that they created a movement, and their movement took over media and the interpretation of Reconstruction that allowed and justified the violence and the murder of Blacks. And then also by doing that, so let me just tell you what lynching does. It also then, it basically have whites to not to want to connect and to unify with Blacks, because they see if you're going into this relationship and collaboration with Blacks, that somehow you picked up the stigma that they had. So it was a way to divide that labor. And so I know that, I hope that answers your question.
Okay, Sean, your mic is open on our end. There you are.
Hi, thank you so much. This has been phenomenal. I think on Tuesday's class, you talked about the abolitionist movement being the most successful reform movement in the US. And that kind of like made a light bulb go off my head. When a lot of times in the left, abolition is sort of framed in opposition to reforms, or at least in certain ultra-left spaces that that you may find yourself in. And that often makes those groups, a lot less effective, because they're not willing to, fight for what's possible and to, give us a leg up in the next struggle. And I was just kind of wondering, like, why is that happening? Or like, how do we think about that? Is that like a form of co-optation from the left, or do you know like when that sort of like framing of abolitionism started? That's something I don't know too much about. So yeah, if I guess that's my question. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much for the compliment. And let me just tell you, because I know we just have a few minutes, what has happened is the oligarchy has picked up abolitionism. They actually have reframed that word. Hillary Rodham Clinton was calling herself an abolitionist. All of them use that word now, abolitionist. Even on the right, they use abolition. Right now in Florida, in St. Augustine yesterday, DeSantis was down there with a Frederick Douglass statue. Go Google it. Just go St. Augustine, Frederick Douglass statue, and there's DeSantis sitting there with Frederick Douglass. So what has happened is that it's been the co-opting and the reframing of what an abolitionist means. And so instead of looking at abolitionism as a collective movement, they've now acted as if it's an individual act. Right. And so then therefore it can it's an individual that, if you can sort of work for it, if you can, it becomes again how you actually sort of see it. Whereas the abolitionist movement was, again, is interracial. It include, all forms of classes, right, ethnicities, and they were, again, had this very focused agenda. Whereas now what happens is that abolitionism has been reframed. They call, again, I know there's some people who are on the left, like use the words like prison abolitionists. But what has happened is that they have now so watered down the term, and then the right have already co-opted it, that it now, mega uses abolition. That word, So what I'm saying is that, again, so it was this taking of and redefining and reframing, right? And again, to sort of take that history. We've seen that before, even when you looked at like people, when they reframed the Republican Party, again, the mission of the Republican Party, after the American Civil Rights Movement, or right during the American Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s. Again, how you had that shift from going from, they flipped ideology somewhat. And so what happens is, again, it's that's reframing. So abolition has this powerful history, but unfortunately, because of that very movement that I was talking about, the United Daughters of the Confederacy and the Sons of the Confederacy, they took people like Thaddeus Stevens. Right now in Pennsylvania, if you ask the average student in Pennsylvania, who is Thaddeus Stevens, a college student, they cannot tell you that. Because what they did in this movie, The Birth of a Nation, they made anybody who was an abolitionist a raging liberal that was anti-America, anti-patriotic. And so then that movie, The Birth of a Nation, the way that one of the main characters, they actually used Thaddeus Stevens, even down to he had a club foot. You can actually see it. They renamed him, but they actually have that in. So what they did was make abolitionism white liberalism and anti-whiteness. And so then, therefore, they sort of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. That's in the Sons of the Confederacy. They redefined it then. But then in the 1990s, in the turn of this century, what happens is that people picked up the word, but unfortunately, it had already lost the original meanings. Again, if you look at the story of Thaddeus Stevens and the way that the United Daughters of the Confederacy reworked his life and sort of have him, that in many ways erased his life, but he refused to even be buried in a segregated grave. Thaddeus Stevens, when he built the school that he actually had, he refused to ever have it as segregation. So again, he has this rich legacy, but because of the way that the media end up depicting him an abolitionist, right? They made him to be, misguided whites that actually threatened America.
Okay, we'll take one more question. Cordero has his hand up. Okay, Cordero, your mic is open on our end. There you are.
Thanks. I'm very glad that it feels like we have come back full circle from, I'm pronouncing her name right, Miss Shirley Du Bois,
Yes. Mm-hmm.
making a contribution as an international member of the African diaspora.
Mm-hmm.
I want to bring back up the two things. The one, she lost her job, yet she was still able to use her organizing skills to fund change.
Yes.
And also this concept of why we don't share biography for celebrity, yet it feels like that's the only way that a capitalist system knows how to deal with a Black woman's identity, is how famous is she? You have pinpointed literally where I'm from. West Helena, Arkansas. I'm from Cross County, Arkansas. I'm a stone's throw from Memphis, Tennessee.
Ida B. Wells is grounded one time. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
As much as I see that if Du Bois, Shirley Du Bois went to Oberlin, which is a white institution. Du Bois himself, if I'm not mistaken, went to Harvard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That we still seem to not be welcomed, like in those spaces. Do you think that this 3-act opera by Shirley Du Bois could possibly get performed at a school in Arkansas today? Because I don't think so.
So right now, what they have is right now Harvard. You mentioned Harvard. Actually, Harvard ended up getting control of it because they thought it was lost. So right now, it's actually housed at Harvard. And so what happens is that people have talked about the play. Let's see what actually ends up happening. But Kadera, I want to say something to you that is very interesting. And again, I want to go back because then Shirley Graham Du Bois and this idea of, do I think that we can put things on ourselves? And I think that's the big piece, is that it's the goal is to make it seems like it's such a juggernaut, such a giant that it can't be, taken out. But here's, again, I want to tell you that she and Ida B. Wells are operating when? Before there was blacks had any civil rights. Remember, the abolitionist movement, it was before many women had the right to vote. So again, they're operating in a world, but they have no civil rights. And then also they're operating in a world in which black people could be lynched with impunity. They didn't, they can be lost or whatever, and people don't think about it. So I guess what I think that we need to sort of keep in mind is that we are the ones that we're waiting for, because we hold these truths to be self-evident. And I just want to leave on this piece about how systems work. In your lifetime, in my lifetime, we saw someone. That's why I said we can't get up and get caught up in celebrity, right? Because right now there was a young man. He did everything right. He was smart. He was, he worked real hard, and he decided that he wanted to take a knee for justice. He had a whole system lock him out. They basically never let him play football again, because again, he took a knee for justice, right? But he didn't really, what did he, it's like Muhammad Ali, that you go and you keep moving forward. You keep going with your, with your movements. And that, so we got to think about, the goal is for us we are not, like Frederick Douglass said, agitate, agitate, agitate. Power conceives nothing without a demand. The goal is to always keep the demand and the pressure. That was what Ida B. Wells' work did. That's what W.B. Bois did. That's what people in the party do. I mean, because if I tell you how they put the pressure on the federal government to help to get the young victims of the Scottsboro case, right? Again, they end up having some, because of the injustice, but the Communist Party was the ones who basically were the ones that got out the Scottsboro boys. That was their defense. And right now, to this day, the Communist Party gave one thing to all Americans: the right to a jury of your peers. That came out of Scottsboro. So what happens is that you got to apply pressure, right? Because you got to hold that. So that's the reason that they don't like to teach the revolutionary document in our communities, all over. It doesn't matter what race, ethnicity, or what you are, because when you start talking about that document saying you have the right to overthrow and not to be in consent, that's very, revolutionary talk. And again, what you saw with the lives of Ida B. Wells, what you see in the lives of, again, the many Ida B. Wells that some of them names we'll know, some of them we know, the Shirley Graham, the Bois, the ones that we may know and not know. That's why I said it's a collective system that end up, toppling down. The civil rights movement was a collective system. We know Martin Luther King and, Rosa Parks and some of the more famous names, but for the most part, it was those everyday people that was really putting that pressure that worked. That you and I now is limited as what can seem to be much limitations in the like sort, but they end up bringing and making America freer. That's the one thing that we can say about the women that I talked about today, but then the systems that they went against. And when we talk about African American history, reality is African Americans and that people from below and their allies have made America a freer nation. And that is what we sort of work with in the party. And at that moment, I think it's 29:30, you all. It's been nice and it's been a pleasure. I hope you got something out of this. Peace and progress to you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Tonya. We look forward to, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight. We hope you will join us on Saturday when we will be in conversation with Joe Sims, Saturday, February 28th at 12 p.m., at 12 noon Eastern, and the conversation will concern stopping the civil rights counter-revolution. So thank you again, Dr. Tonya. Your Mississippi charm and hospitality is quite delightful.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. See you, everyone. Good night.